Evening, everyone. All day I've been checking online, checking live updates to see if there's any more news about what's going to happen, whether there's going to be a Pakistani solution and a ceasefire, or whether 8 o'clock all hell is going to break loose in Iran, as Donald Trump has promised in the event they don't come to the negotiating table and agree to most, if not all, the terms that his administration has presented them. It's 6:17 p.m. Eastern time here right now, April 7, year of our Lord 2026. And to my knowledge, and I'm not checking online as we're on our live stream, so rather than spend most of this live stream trying to check constant updates, because with less than 2 hours until that deadline, probably just about anything could happen between now and then. In fact, nothing could happen. In fact, nothing could happen at 8 p.m. There could be some more diversions. There could be some other tactics. We don't know exactly what the American military action will be at or after 8 p.m. We just know it's very, very serious, and the military is on the highest of alert, and we're preparing for what could happen at 8 p.m. tonight. So I want to give you what I really want to do, spend our time doing, is give you a recap of my understanding about Iran. And it really goes back. I don't know. I'd heard of the Shah in the 1970s. I was a teenager. And in 1979, I knew little else. But I spent a lot of time with my grandfather then, and he was a typical American, had served in World War II, and believed in American military might. And I can remember him saying over a Sunday dinner once, if they don't release our hostages, we give them notice. And if they don't do it, we bomb the hell out of them. And that's what's about to happen now, 47 years later. So what I want to do is kind of give you a look at that 47 years and what it's really like. I know we've got people on all sides, my age, older, much younger, thinking about a different perspective. Look, like many of you, I supported President Trump in his reelection campaign in 2024, mostly because of what I saw on the other side and what we had lived through the preceding 4 years before that. What I saw in Afghanistan, how I saw so much capitulation of our government, more than anything, to people crossing our borders illegally, but a lot of cultural issues that were just horrendous, nothing I've ever lived through in my life. In 2024, I knew two things about Trump's foreign policy for sure, really more if you count tariffs and other things. But I knew that he was generally an anti war president. And I also knew that he really had a hard time about and with Iran. And he had carried that with him for all 47 years, the Islamic Republic and the Shiite regime had been in control of the country. So I want to do to kick off the live stream is give a brief look at someone who knows Iran well. I believe he was born in Iran. He has Iranian ancestors and understands the challenges in the country. He's one of my favorite podcasters, I think one of the best in America today. So let's take a look at what Patrick Bet David had to say about the situation as it is now.
Iran was so powerful. It was top 5 military in the world. Mohammad Reza Shah Pahlavi was doing an amazing job. He was painted as a bad guy because of Savak. Savak was his Mossad or CIA or MI6. Savak was trained by CIA. And when the Shah was running Iran, there was no war in Iran. You would never hear the phrase Mark bar Amerika, but it wasn't like that pre-79. It was a beautiful top 3 places in the world to go for tourism. Iran in the 70s.
3 places to go for tourism in the 1970s. Today, We think about Greece. We think about places like Machu Picchu in South America. We think about, of course, Europe, as people did in the 1970s, but it was more of a travel destination in the Middle East. Dubai was just a very small city back then, with the beginnings of its new culture and development that it has today. Iran was a place to go. It was a friend of the US. Now, we could go further back in history and look at the CIA coup of the 1950s that really helped, if not effectively, put the Shah into power and created a lot of the situation we had in the 1970s. But we're not going to do that today because that's not who we're dealing with. We are dealing with the Islamic Republic of Iran, the IRCG. We are dealing with the people who sponsored proxies all over the Middle East, have threatened and caused terror even here in our own homeland very recently in the state of Michigan. So we're talking about dealing directly with the Iran that is today and the situation we have today. And we want to go through that in some detail. We know that this is an entrenched regime. It's a very deeply religious regime. It's been there for 47 years. It's had two leaders in that time, both who went by the title Ayatollah, and both whose names sounded hauntingly similar to each other, and both who ruled through severe repression of their people. And we know that the only way regime change is ever effective, and it's much more challenging in a country like Iran, being governed by the type of religious radical fundamentalists who are in power there today. So Donald Trump knew that. He's known that. Every president before him knew that. And we still remember Vietnam and how we tried to arm citizens to help overthrow the takeover of one government by another. They had a much shorter history with the repressive regime that was in power when we tried to help their citizens than the Iranian government does today. But it was similar in another respect, in that the only way it was going away, or even would go away today, is if the people themselves rose up and threw off their chains. That didn't go very well for the United States. It's the one time we could say, at least before Afghanistan, in our history, that maybe we didn't have an entirely successful military campaign where we went. You could argue that that was true in Korea and elsewhere, but after 11 years and really more in Vietnam, we walked away from that country in 1975, not only without a victory, but what resulted ultimately in a loss of an ally in Vietnam. Um, in Iran, we're now in a place where the government's been entrenched for 47 years. And we know that for that government to change, nature abhors a vacuum. Something's got to take its place. And we want it to be something peace loving. Well, peace loving citizens are often unarmed and often at the will of their governments, who insist on taking away their arms. And that's certainly the case in Iran. So what do? Well, we try to help arm them. And that is what we did. And how did that go for us? So let's take a look at what happened when the U.S. Tried to provide arms to the citizens, Iranian citizens, recently.
Trey Yingst is the chief foreign correspondent for Fox News. He said the president sent guns to the Iranian protesters earlier this year, and I'm assuming it was when the protests started. And remember the Kurds that we were talking about? The Kurds were getting armed, and they were going to go and fight. Look at what the president told Trey. Go ahead.
Now, the president also provided new details on what happened earlier this year as the Iranian regime took to the streets and slaughtered what the president tells me is 45,000 civilians in their own country. After that took place, President Trump told me the United States sent guns to the Iranian protesters. He tells me we sent them a lot of guns. We sent them through the Kurds, and the president says he thinks the Kurds kept them. He went on to say we sent guns to the protesters, a lot of them. And so a number of headlines here from my conversation with President Trump. All of this taking place more than a month into Operation Epic Fury, and in the aftermath of that successful U.S. operation over.
So that's, I mean, Pat, that's pretty. But Adam, that's pretty. Like, I remember we were talking about should we send guns because we were thinking about options. Apparently.
Okay, the Kurds. So we made an effort to arm the citizenry of Iran, and you know what? That may ultimately work out. That may be the ultimate play. We don't know how this is all going to play out. And we don't know what the Kurds' role, but the Kurds are a very interesting group of people. If we think back to the first Gulf War, Iraq won in the early 1990s, Bush 41, Senior Bush, Papa Bush, and his war, when we forced Iraq, out of Kuwait, and we won an overwhelming victory from where we were, kind of like where we are today, frankly, with Iran. And then what happened? Saddam Hussein bombed his own citizens, who happened to be Kurds, live in the northern part of Iraq. He gassed them, in fact, and killed hundreds of thousands of them, it's claimed. And the same thing has happened to Kurds in Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. The Kurds are an unpopular people, and we're not going to spend a lot of time talking about their history. But we thought because we tried to step in for them later and because we claimed to stand up for them, that they were our allies and friends. And it's always been a tenuous friendship because we don't want to jeopardize any kind of relationships we have with countries like Turkey, who is very much opposed to the Kurds. And, you know, if we rebuild a relationship with Iran, what is our relationship with the Kurds going to mean to that? But they're the only resource we had to get into Iran and to get weapons to the people of Iran. And frankly, I'm confident, though I don't have the military intelligence, I've read a lot of reports that we believe that the Kurds would be on the front lines fighting to remove the current regime, the Islamic Republic. Well, we don't know where that's going, but it certainly didn't go where we thought it was going to go. The guns that were intended to be passed off through our broker, the Kurds, didn't reach the people we wanted it to. And what was the result of that? Estimates are, I don't know why the number that gets most pegged in the news media is 45,000. Maybe it's accurate or not, but 45,000 of its own people. We're not talking about enemy combatants. We're not talking about people from other countries. We're talking about 45,000 people, many of whom were probably loyal Shiite Muslims, were executed and just frankly slaughtered by the Islamic regime in January when they stood up, and there were mass protests early this year. And I think that has a lot to do with why we are where we are today. Now, I could talk all night and I could talk about the development of the history that we've gone through to get to where we are today. And we will to some extent. In fact, why don't we take a look at our next clip, clip 5, on how the Islamic Republic has treated its own people over time. So, and if we go back to, is it possible to put that on center screen? I want to try to figure that out for a moment before we go to the next transition. Can we make that a bit bigger so we can look at that more closely together? Okay, well, it's a little bit, all right, so maybe we can adjust that and maybe we can get that into the framing. So now if we can bring that into the transition, that would be great. Okay, so now we've got a bit closer. Let's take a look. First of all, you have to think back to what Iraq was like in the 1960s and 70s. And we'll close with a little short video history. And it's sad to think that Iran was such a Western country. And I'm not suggesting that, I mean, I spend time in China. China is never going to be a Western country. It doesn't need to be. And sometimes it's to the detriment of a nation's own culture to be overly influenced by America or European culture. And let's be honest, as close as the ties were between America and Iran during that period of time, like most other countries that are influenced by the West, those influences primarily start with and seem to be predominantly European. French, for example, the French have a very strong influence on most of the other westernized cultures in the world. And yes, the US does as well. But if you take the freedom, all I want to think about is the freedom of the Iranian people, and particularly the freedom of Iranian women, how they were able to dress, what they were able to do professionally, the rights that they had back in the 1970s. That all changed. And almost immediately after that, the post-revolution change was there was an execution of more than 4,500 secular liberals. These were educators, these were journalists, they were all the people who the regime considered to be threats. Now, the religious aspect of that is important, but wasn't the central issue in terms of who the enemies of the state were to the Islamic Republic. The Islamic Republic considered people, the intelligentsia, and they considered people who were espousing freedom in any way. It wasn't Christians and it wasn't necessarily Jews who they came after. It was people who had the ability to more directly influence the people within the culture. And yes, it's very, very true that the religious aspects of the regime became highly dominant and they changed things very fast. And so, what happened during the 10 years after, during the time when uh, Khomeini with an O, the first Ayatollah reigned, was that the heavy handed religious repression took hold and women were forced into the hijab, the head coverings, and changed the way they could dress. They could not own property. They couldn't travel without their husbands. So many of their freedoms were taken away from them. They weren't allowed to drive, and the repression fell hardest on women. And it has been the women of Iran who have begun to speak up. And that's an interesting dynamic. And we are not in a position to be able to get into that too deeply here. But I can say, I can only imagine that as a man who's been married and watched so many of my friends, family, people who have been married, the conversations that have to go on at home, women had to be saying they're going to have some freedom, exert their influence. They often run the domestic front and usually do, in fact. And that's no less true in, I don't think, in an Islamic marriage than it is in a Christian marriage. So now there are examples and scenes of men, Muslim men, beating their wives, which is lawful for them to do in their countries, but it's probably no more accepted privately and among their families. I mean, these women who are mistreated by their husbands, they have fathers and brothers too. And they believe in upholding their own pride and family and interest. So at any rate, but the repression fell hardest on the women. Eventually, the Ayatollah got so repressive he resorted into massacring prisoners themselves and went further. And then Ayatollah Khomeini died in 1989. And then there was a period of relative calm, if you will, if not peace. You have to understand that in the 1980s, Iran spent that entire decade at war with Iraq. We befriended Iraq. Then we felt that Iraq had turned on us when they invaded Kuwait. And so we, in turn, fought back against Iraq. And from 1991 until 2009, the final conquest of Iraq, we'd established a democratic government there. Was kind of democratic government any of us envisioned or not is a totally different question. But for that 20-year period, Iraq was our primary enemy. We kind of forgot. We had amnesia about Iran for that period of time. So what happened in 2009 was the Green Movement evolved, and eventually which were protests, and eventually the Iranian government suppressed that revolution as well, and they called it Bloody November, when over 1,000 Iranians were killed, largely in the streets, and a handful of executions in only 12 days. It was their internal 12-day war, in fact, if you will. So that lasted for over a decade. And then in 2022 and 2023, when people were taking off their masks in public after COVID, women decided it was time for them to protest as well. Actually, that went pretty well for the Iranian people and for Iranian women, because by this time, you're dealing with a new generation. And again, I think a lot of the women, through their fathers, their brothers, sisters, even their own husbands, understood that this was no way for a country to function in the 21st century. But it tried, and it made harsher and harsher laws and was more and more repressive over time. And again, over 500 people were killed in a short period of time. Also, this is a period, one thing, well, we'll look at that in a second, but many of the Iranian proxies around the Middle East were functioning in similarly repressive ways against people in their own lands, whether it was Palestine or Syria or elsewhere. Okay, so now here we are in 2026, and we all saw what was happening in Tehran and other cities in Iran in January of this year, where the uprising, I mean, I have to say that I felt by January 8th or 9th that the probability that Iran, that the government would be overthrown and we would be looking at true regime change from within was about to happen. You could just feel that in your bones if you were watching the news during that time. But it didn't. Instead, the Iranians turned their guns on their own people again and killed something like 45,000 people. So you see, there is a long history of all of these 47 years, beginning immediately before the revolution and continuing in fits and spurts throughout the periods of dominance by the Islamic Republic that leads right up until today. And I have to say that what happened in January made the war that we're in the middle of right now nearly, if not necessarily, inevitable. And why? Because I don't think that President Trump, frankly, could look at that historically, providentially, politically, and say, this is a regime we're going to be able to make peace with. This is a regime that is going to cooperate with the world community and shed their ability to create nuclear weapons for themselves. This is a regime that's going to work with us. Okay, so if we move on from there, and then let's talk about the next clip if we can. Let's go to the next clip.
In 1979, everything unraveled. A popular uprising, fueled by students, clerics, workers, and entire swaths of the population, forced the Shah to flee. Into that vacuum returned Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini, after years in exile. Within weeks, Iran was declared an Islamic republic, and within months, the old alliances had not just ended, they were inverted. Israel's embassy was seized and handed over to the PLO. American advisors were expelled. SAVAK was dismantled. And on November 4, 1979, a group of young revolutionaries stormed the United States Embassy in Tehran. 52 Americans were taken hostage. The hostage crisis lasted 444 days.
We'll go back. That's 47 years ago, 444 days. I feel like I can remember every single one of those days. I remember watching the news on every single one of those days. I remember the advent of Nightline with Ted Koppel and him announcing each day as it was added to the previous day. And I was only 17 years old when that happened. It was, I think, perhaps America's worst nightmare, at least I would say, at any time before COVID. And it was tragic and terrible, and it showed a weakness in the president that we had at the time and the strength of the president who took his place, which was Ronald Reagan, and what the hope it began to rebuild for the American people as our hostages were released and we didn't stand for being treated, being overwhelmed by terrorism any longer by an Islamic regime. And so we've had this standoff now for 47 years, but it hasn't come without incident. So if we can jump to the next clip and talk about what the Islamic regime has done against the United States in that period of time. Now, look, the reason I want to go over this is I want people to understand that however you feel about where we are with this war, this is not something that happened overnight. It's not something that wasn't provoked over and over and over again. We had the hostage crisis in 1979. In 1983, we had soldiers stationed in Beirut, Lebanon, who were attacked by Hezbollah. Hezbollah, one of Iran's proxies. Hezbollah, a terrorist organization that exists to spread Shiite Sharia law throughout the Middle East and to eliminate the United States, whom they consider to be the great Satan, but even more to push Israel into the sea. That has been their stated goal from the beginning. Hezbollah from the east and north, and Hamas from the south to push against Israel for Islamic purposes, Shiite Islamic purposes, funded and controlled by the Islamic regime. So this continued, and then Congress, and then the president, and then Congress declared Iran a terrorist state, which we have viewed them as since 1983. Fast forward way ahead of that time to 2003, immediately before we invaded Iraq. And remember President Bush's State of the Union address that year. He declared an axis of evil that consisted of Iran, Iraq, and North Korea. And so even though Iraq and Iran at that time were mortal enemies on opposite sides of the Islamic fundamentalism, one taking a dominant Shiite approach, the other taking, even though they are primarily Shiites in Iraq, but yet they had a much more secularized approach. And nationalistically, Saddam Hussein and the Islamic regime were mortal enemies and always had been. And you might think about the Khobar Tower bombing in 1996, or the attacks immediately preceding the Iraq War, the Tower 22 drone attack in 2024. We've been provoked over and over and over and over again by the Iranians. I remember when our seamen were captured and held at gunpoint during the Obama administration. So many other instances where they've taken hostages, American journalists, where they've allowed people to die or even killed Americans. So this is the ultimate enemy that we've ever had. North Korea, as much of a threat, as much bluster as there is, as much as they're doing right now as a cybersecurity threat, they've never made the direct kind of threats that the Iranian regime has made. And Iran has used many, many proxies to do that. So if we can move on from this chart to take a look next at those proxies and who they are and where they are. I just want to give you a moment to take a peek at them. Can we go to now?
The year 1983, on October 23rd, Hezbollah attacked American troops stationed in Lebanon. It was a suicide bomb explosion. 241 U.S. service members were killed. This was the deadliest day for American Marines since the Second World War. In the aftermath, U.S. forces were withdrawn from Lebanon.
Okay, so that was mixed in there, I think, a bit out of order, but it's very important. It was very important to that last segment. So now if we can look at the next table that involves the Iranian proxies, and this is big, and I want to just give you a moment to study and think about the influences of the Iranian regime in the Middle East and the harms that they present. Does anybody remember, like me, that period around 2015 and 2016 when ISIS became such, I can still remember John Kerry always talking about Daesh, which is an Arabic name, I believe, for ISIS, or what they call themselves in the Middle East. That terrorist organization was beheading Americans as well as many, many other people that they considered to be their enemies, not as combatants, not as military people, but people they perceived as a threat because they were journalists, scholars, stood up for their own personal religious beliefs in Christianity and otherwise. And ISIS was beheading people constantly and doing it on live television. And if you remember the first Trump administration, the one thing that he did was they took out ISIS, and they did it quickly and effectively. And in taking out ISIS, Donald Trump had made a declaration that the Iranian terrorist threat was not going to continue to be a terrorist threat to the United States of America. I watch, I see, I hear, whether it's Tucker Carlson, Marjorie Taylor Greene, Candace Owens, tons of other people who are saying day by day that Trump has betrayed his base. Absolutely not. I think that is a false statement when it comes to Iran. Now, if you don't agree with his tactics and you want to second guess the commander in chief, I understand that. I mean, I got to a point with the Iraq war when I said some of what I heard, I got behind it primarily because Colin Powell testified, I believe it was before a joint session of Congress, that the weapons of mass destruction that supposedly Saddam Hussein had in his possession and hidden, were going to be used against us, and it was only a matter of time. Is it true or false that the enriched uranium that was at 60% that the Iranians had immediately before we attacked was about to be taken to a weapons grade level within 10 days, as Steve Witkoff apparently had told the president? Well, I trust them. I trust them and I believe them. Now, I trust Bush and Colin Powell back in 2003. But it doesn't matter in this sense. It does matter, but it doesn't matter in this sense. Donald Trump has always been consistent. He was consistent in the 1980s when he would go on the Oprah Winfrey Show or other television programs, when he'd make public statements, as he was in the mid 2000 teens when he was determined to take out ISIS, and he is today. Now, is it true? Okay, let's admit, I'm not going to deny that President Trump has a unique bond with Benjamin Netanyahu, and that a lot of that bond probably comes through, almost certainly comes through his son-in-law, Jared Kushner. Okay, that's a reality. But he also has unique bonds with other countries on the Arabian Peninsula, particularly Saudi Arabia. And he even has a good relationship, it would appear, with countries like Qatar, which is a stated Islamic government. It is ruled by Islamic law, I believe. And Trump has built relationships with much of the Middle East. The only parts of the Middle East where he hasn't built relationships of good trade, semi-allegiances, no threats to the United States militarily in any way, are those that are aligned directly with Iran. And Trump has been very consistent that the Iranian threat was not going to be a threat to the United States and to, he perceives to be our very good friend in Israel. Now, in other live streams at other times, we'll talk about Israel and our tenuous relationships with them. There's a lot, it's very complex. There's a lot to be said there. But the point is that we are where we are today. And Donald Trump is dead set against the leadership of the Iranian regime, and he doesn't want them to ever be a threat to the United States. And he is our commander in chief. And I'm not pleading with blind allegiance to him or anyone else. In a sense, we don't have a choice. In another sense, we are Americans and we're loyal to our country and we're loyal to our flag and we want to support it. But if you look at what the Iranian threat really consists of in Iraq today, still, after Saddam Hussein was overthrown, in Syria, in Lebanon, in the Gaza Strip, it's still there and it's still fighting. And particularly out of Lebanon, it is using every resource it can in Lebanon right now to try to keep Israel cornered. Okay, so I'm getting a little camera feed. I'm not sure what it's about, but we'll keep going and we'll keep talking. Okay, so let's move on from there. So before we come to an end, I want us to put things in perspective. And I want us to think about what life is like. And I've alluded to the situation for women. I've had a couple of very good friends who are Iranian women, or their mothers were from Iran. I've had male friends as well. And they all know what the Islamic regime is all about. But I can only imagine what life could be like for women in Iran. Americans can't imagine that. I saw a clip, I almost included it, of Bill Maher talking with Anna Kasparin from the Young Turks. And she's wearing a cute American dress and speaking her mind. And he pointed out to her very carefully, you will support Iran all you want, but you wouldn't be free to wear that. You wouldn't be free to have this conversation. You wouldn't be free to go out in public as you sit here with me today if you were in Iran. Do you have any appreciation or even any sensibility about what your freedoms are like here? And that's a real challenge. And so as we go to the next clip, I want to talk about how that has come to be and how the Iranian regime has enforced their repression, and look at the ultimate they've caused. Okay, so that's just one example. And boy, that's how harsh and difficult life has become, particularly for women since 1979 in Iran. And their sisters, their friends who live here in the United States, who live in the West, mostly all they've been able to do is empathize, sympathize with them over there because they haven't been able to get them out and they haven't been able to change things. This is an opportunity to change the world. I do not want to see a country bombed into the Stone Age. I do not want that. That would be a horrible tragedy. And I hope that something happens. All kinds of things are possible. With God, all things are possible. Peace could break out for 8 p.m. And that is my prayer. And I hope it's your prayer as well. But as we get ready to close, let's take a look at what life was like before Islam in Iran. So Don Henley was famous for a line in a song that he wrote. It said, "Don't look back, you can never look back." Well, it might also be true that you can never go back. I don't suspect that we're ever going to go back to an Iran that looks like it did in the 1960s and 1970s. We can hope, we can pray, and we can hope and pray more than anything else that peace will prevail. But if the Islamic regime has to be taken out by force, well, we pray so fervently for the Iranian people. The new day on the other side of that, we hope and believe, will be that there will be a country that won't be living in repression. And you have to know that if that happens, the the United States of America will be at the front of the line and perhaps the only country who will do anything to help rebuild it. But pray for the peace, pray for the well-being, the welfare of the Iranian people, and pray that those crazy mullahs come to their senses before it's too late. God bless you. Thanks for watching. May the Lord bless and keep you, make his face shine upon you. May he be gracious to you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen.